5 were hospitalized, 1 very briefly, 4 of them in ICU, and 3 of them on ventilators. So I got very quickly versed in the situation that was unfolding at a personal level at the beginning of March.
Are all 13 still with us?
They are all with us. They've all survived,
Wow.
and 12 of them have recovered fully. 1 of them is no longer positive, but he has long-term issues resulting from the disease. But he is doing well, and he will survive, thank goodness. But that said, I had taken a look very early on at what was going on and some of the things that were coming out of China, and I began looking at their positions on hydroxychloroquine. So based upon that, I had been monitoring what's going on in that arena, and found some quite disappointment. I was disappointed in the manner in which this is unfolded as a result of the president early on mentioning this as a potential therapeutic, and then the onslaught that appeared to me to be rather politically motivated. And as a result of that, my concern is that a drug that ought to be used is not being used the way it should be. It's been characterized incorrectly. It's being tested incorrectly, and it's producing results that are not relevant to what we need to know.
Tell me about tested incorrectly.
So as an antiviral that prevents replication and host cell infection, it's a drug that you would want to take early. So this is a drug that's one of the most used drugs in human history. It's a drug that you can take to, that if you go on a vacation to Africa, for example, or certain parts of Asia where there's a malaria outbreak, you would be prescribed this drug before you go, and you would take it while you were there, and you would take it while you afterwards as a malaria prophylactic. Excuse me. And that would really just be for the purpose of going on vacation. So I call it the going on vacation drug. It's also used for numerous other issues like rheumatoid arthritis and lupus and so forth. But that being said, it's a drug that, if prescribed properly and stayed within doses, it has minimal side effects. The toxicities are manageable, and the toxicities that have been promoted are generally not associated with acute low dose use. In fact, most of the things that have been used as scare tactics in the news are really not applicable even in the FDA database. So when you take a drug,
when you say scare tactics, what do you mean?
So, there are a lot of tactics that are being used to indicate that this is a highly unsafe drug, and it causes heart attacks, and it causes all sorts of complications. And they refer to a number of proof points in that, which we can come back to in a minute. But as far as the approach of testing the drug, if you're going to take a drug that is applicable to prevent replication and cell infection, you generally wouldn't want to start taking that drug after that's occurred. So if you take other examples, if you have, for example, lip herpes, sun blister, and you take an antiviral for that, you don't wait until after it's full blown to start taking the drug. So the way that they are testing and prescribing the drug at this point, and even the manner in which that has unfolded is rather alarming to me. But you don't take it after it's fully systemic and that your body is fully infected. So at that point, it's too late. And so the effect would be minimal. The complications that occur from the disease itself are already in play by the time you've started using this drug as a potential therapeutic. So the idea of this drug having any action would be taking it when you're first symptomatic, not after you're in the hospital half dead.
I have a question from Kathleen. She asks, is there any evidence of I should be able to pronounce it at this point, the H word, taking it as a prophylactic?
So there is some, they are doing some studies on that at this point as a prophylactic. There's certainly plenty of taking it as a malaria. I mean, it's been widely used as a malaria prophylactic, but in terms of COVID, which I assume that's what you're asking, they're doing a number of trials in that regard. And so there are some studies that have come out, I believe, in South Korea. I don't have on the tip of my fingers, but so yes, and they're doing other studies. So there's they're using it throughout New York, I believe, in a variety of studies, but that work hasn't been published yet.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
The drug came into the news again yesterday when the president offered that he's taking it.
Yeah. A lot of doctors are too.
I found his announcement alarming because I'm undereducated about this, and I'm hoping you can tell me if my alarm was justified or not. But I'm concerned about the least educated person listening to him, and perhaps a zealous follower saying, if it's good enough for him, it's good enough for me, and just going and taking it. And that scares me.
Well, it needs to be prescribed by a physician. So, you know, you can't just go pick it up. It's not an over-the-counter drug. So, you know, as long as it's prescribed by a physician for a purpose, it's prescribed, as I said, to go on vacation in Africa. I mean, I've taken it for going on vacation in Africa. I have many friends who've taken it to go on vacation for Africa.
I likely took it too and don't realize it.
Yeah. So, you know, people take it for rheumatoid arthritis. It's, you know, it has anti-inflammatory properties to it. But, you know, the reality is that, you know, you can't just go out and get it. You have to have a physician prescribe it to you. So just, you know, yeah, it shouldn't be alarming that someone says they're taking the drug, whether it's the president or anybody else. There are many physicians taking it, and they talk about it and publicly that they're taking it as a prophylactic. So, you know, to be prescribed the drug for a purpose, and, you know, the reality is that a lot of, you know, there are physicians that are prescribing it properly, but there's a significant amount of effort being employed. Like never in the history have I seen efforts that are being employed to prevent physicians from using this drug off-label. Off-label drugs are, you know, one of those common drugs used, and 1 in 5 drugs are off-label. And yet every effort is being made to prevent access to this drug and to prevent physicians from providing it off-label at their, you know, at their discretion. The FDA doesn't control that, you know, the physicians, and yet they're attempting to do so. You know, they're putting out letters from the California Medical Board and the California Physicians Association to all physicians, saying, you know, threatening them in a not so veiled threat that if they prescribe the drug, that they will, you know, face consequences. And
that's a fascinating perspective I, of course, hadn't considered. So I think what I'm hearing you say is off-label drug use is common. This is being prescribed as an off-label drug, and therefore, why should this be different than any other off-label drug used for an off-label purpose?
yeah, so there are a lot of drugs. For example, gabapentin is one, you know, it's almost all of its applications are off-label. Very little of it, as it was being prescribed, and almost any of them had very little data. This has actually quite a lot of data. A lot of it comes out of Asia. You know, they were doing a lot of work. For example, I mean, I think the only reason why the president, for that matter, even knew of the drug was that it was being evaluated in China. And on February 15th, China had an emergency meeting on hydroxychloroquine. February 17th, they announced that it was that they were going to implement it as standard care. So in South Korea immediately adopted that. Was they were just at the time around the middle of February just having a handful of cases starting to percolate, and they adopted the China guidance on the application of hydroxychloroquine. So, you know, right now the problem is that they're using hydroxychloroquine in patients who are already hospitalized, and at that point, you know, these are patients who have incredible symptomologies associated with this disease, which hydroxychloroquine does not treat. So, if you go back to the paper that I provided you, you show up at the hospital, people are already presenting with hypoxia and hypoxemia related effects, and they are presenting with cytokine storm. By the time they've even been admitted to the hospital, the vast majority of them who are going to deteriorate will do so in a matter of 24 to 48 hours, and certainly within 72 hours. Very common that someone who's going to be that's deteriorating will do so very, very rapidly. So by the time they're presenting with systemic inflammatory response, the disease causes is now being shown to providing or causing clotting abnormalities systemically. And so by the time you are providing an antiviral that is whose mechanism of function is to stop replication and stop cell invasion, by the time you already have that, these effects are already happening. You have people that are coming in not even knowing that they're already septic. They're already septic, and they have secondary infections already occurring as a result of the pneumonia, because that all happens almost instantaneously. So now you're trying to use a drug, you're trying to test that drug for its effectiveness based upon treating all sorts of complications that it doesn't treat. So now you have, the disease itself causes cardiac failure, kidney failure, brain damage. One of my friends, my friend who's not doing so well, by the way, he's recovering, but he was on he had renal failure, so he was on dialysis. He is going to have all 10 of his fingers amputated because they've all gone necrotic. He's going to lose several toes. He no longer has full function of his lower legs. He has his thank God his kidneys have come back. But he has permanent damage as a result of this, and his lung capacity is now, and so the fact that you don't have to the number of patients in a cohort to cohort that will die of various complications from heart attack, myocardial infarction, cardiomyopathy, heart failure, multi-organ failure is vast. And it varies in small groups regardless of what treatments you're giving them. So you're trying, so all these studies now that are trying to evaluate the effectiveness of a drug that should be provided at the outset. If you take Tamiflu because you get a virus cold, you don't take it after you're already in the hospital with pneumonia. You take it at the beginning when you first have symptoms. So the idea that you'd be testing a drug that has antiviral properties to prevent to stop the continued replication of the disease in your body, so that your body then has time to clear the virus. So the idea that you would assume that that mechanism of action is somehow going to help bring someone back in kidney failure that's caused by hypoxic inflammation is a rather absurd premise.
Questions are beginning to come in, as I knew they would. My head is spinning, so thank you for that.
Sure.
It doesn't happen.
Whatever I can do to help.
What's that?
Whatever I can do to help.
Yeah, if you have a script for that, I'd appreciate it. Let me reframe what you've been sharing.
Yeah.
Congratulations, you have been ordained President of the United States, head of the CDC, WHO, and every other body, and you are the one laying out our policy, for our public policy for health on COVID-19. What are some of the first things that you would do?
I don't know that I really want to play a hypothetical game about being the president right now. So, there are so many things that were done at the outset that relate to, CDC's functionality and FDA's functionality in our very bureaucratic world that we live in, that have been ascribed to the president, and when in fact, our long-standing, as you would know in medical devices, and certainly drug development, our long-standing, bureaucratic regulations that control all of that, I mean, the first thing I would do is to try to ensure that we could, you know, roll things out. And I believe that's some of what was done. But things like, you know, testing and so forth. You know, if you're talking specifically about hydroxychloroquine, then you'd have to be more specific about your question.
What would you like to see America's information be about?
Hydroxychloroquine.
You know, the funny thing is, I've been using it effectively in a sentence all week. Maybe I'm just nervous. Because I had a group member, my friend Larry, say that a lot of the negative information was politically motivated.
Yes, and I agree with that.
I think that's a fair point. And frankly, on that side of the aisle, I've been consuming a lot of it. So I hear the H word, and I think, I read, you know, superficially that that's not the drug to be using. Then I hear someone who's in charge saying, but I'm using it. And I'm thinking, you are telling me something that science just told me not to do. But
science didn't tell you not to do. That's your fundamental flaw right there. Science didn't tell you not to do it. In fact, the science that suggests is all flawed. I mean, you know, that's part of the reason I wrote the paper, to show you how flawed the science is. So, you know, that's flaw number one in your statement. So, you know, the problem is that in order to do the science, and the effort to actually do the science is being thwarted. So right now, what I would suggest is that we have an immediate effort to do trials immediately. So if you go look at, you know, trials for for FDA approval, pivotal trials for FDA approval of antiviral drugs, you know, those are generally done on on day zero, symptom day zero. They enroll patients and they immediately start providing them, and then they evaluate outcomes. We could have proper scientific answers in this on properly designed studies that were not being designed to tank the drug. You know, measuring it, taking outcome measures that can't possibly be measuring the effect of the drug. They're measuring the effect of the disease. And so, you know, the idea that we wouldn't actually immediately, we should have been doing immediately proper constructed trials based upon the information that was coming from from foreign countries like China, that were, you know, immediately indicating that they were having significant results. And as a result, we should have implemented that immediately in mild patients, just symptomatic, and evaluated them. I mean, if it's okay for you to take it to go on vacation in Africa 4 months pregnant, okay, and it has been for 70 years, and suddenly now we have a problem. I mean, this is an example. I paid $200 to pull the FDA database. There were, you know, out of 5.6 million prescriptions in 1 year, there were 9 deaths, one of which was a suicide, and the others were, you know, long-term use, certainly not a 5-day short-term regimen. You know, you're it was like a 0.00016 chance of having a fatal complications of hydroxychloroquine as the primary cause or suspected cause. So, you know, the idea that we would be confusing, you know, and really, even, you know, I don't even know where the statisticians are on this. The statisticians seem to be out to lunch, because when you look at the number of co-founding covariates affecting, you know, the outcome of a group of 100 to 200 patients, or even 500 patients, with the variability of this disease is randomly variable, and the outcomes, and we're just misusing the data. It's misapplied and misused. So I would immediately apply for trials that are properly designed, and we would have answers in a matter of 2 weeks, scientific ones.
Are you aware of any properly designed studies being fielded right now?
So I haven't done an update. I mean, I reviewed 17 studies that were on clinicaltrials.gov, you know, a couple weeks ago. I think they've been updated, so I'd have to take a look at the update. Oh gosh, now I have to pull up my info. Of the 17, there was one that was even remotely applying the drug the correct way, because the pathophysiological approach of the drug would imply that you would want to take it with zinc, certainly with zinc, and possibly with azithromycin. So that's been the proposed mechanism, and I outline in my paper reasons why that has been proposed and why in some places that has been shown to work more effectively. So there is only one study. It's the most unscientific of the studies, and it doesn't produce results until somewhere in 2021. And I don't think we want to wait that long. And it only was on 60 patients. It wasn't double blind. In fact, it was a single arm study. So of all other 17 studies, almost all of them were either studying patients who were, severe, already, hospitalized. You're using a drug to treat patients in kidney failure and in multi-organ failure and in hypoxia with damage all over. And so, most of them are late studies. There were a couple prophylactic studies, large prophylactic studies that hopefully will be coming out in the next couple of months. I don't know why we couldn't be doing studies that we could literally, given the urgency of the situation, this is not your average situation. The world matters in terms and cares about what the results are right now, and we want speed. We don't need to be waiting for 6 months to get a publication. We should be having immediate announcements, but we should these studies that are the ones that I've reviewed, certainly they had some that were prophylactic and they had some that were not complete. So they were doing hydroxychloroquine, but not with the zinc. And it's, one of the key mechanisms of hydroxychloroquine working is that it enables zinc to enter the cell and adjust the pH, which prevents the virus from entering and replicating in the cell. So that's so it's not optimized. There are a couple that are not optimized, but the ones that are there, but they may be coming out later this year. Again, too little, too late as far as the data, and then, or they're just too late.
I want to share a personal observation. First, a shout out to Jeremy again for introducing us. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Second, I find that I'm humbled by the degree of knowledge you bring to this topic. And third, while I've been leading this group for nearly 9 years and have interviewed very many people, I find that I'm nervous talking with you. And I'm sharing this because I'm so far out of my element, because I typically just talk about devices, not drugs. Yeah. I don't know the first thing about it. And you've caught me in my ignorance, which I really give to the world about how little I know. But let me offer this. I do marketing strategy for a living. Sure. And I'm a dad. And I tell my children, perception is reality. Mm-hmm. I perceive you're a jerk. You're a jerk. Whether or not you are actually a jerk, I perceive that you are, and therefore you are. Given the complexity, I mean, what you're saying, I'm reasonably intelligent. I'm trying hard to track with you. I'm going to argue that I pay more attention than the average person watching the news. The red news, the blue news, the white news, whatever news. Mm-hmm. This is so complex. And I'm not asking you as a policymaker and how do we solve miscommunication and disinformation, but gosh darn it, I don't know how we could reasonably or effectively communicate something as important as this, right? Objectively. I was, if you'll indulge just at the end of the thought, it's, I put something on my Facebook. I was talking about masks, and I got into this debate about mask good, mask bad, and I had a position on that based in my own biases. And somebody said, why do you trust everything that comes out of a government body? And I said, no, but I would like to think that the CDC, who is in charge of the World Health Organization, in charge of our well-being, could be as pure a body as there is, that there's not a political bias to keeping us safe. And therefore, if the CDC says something, that I should be able to just accept it? You are shaking your head no about my ignorance. Go ahead and tell me why.
No, I just have had so much experience with these government bodies, and don't get me started about,
I got you
FDA
started. Go
and
on.
cancer. I mean, I made a documentary. And in fact, I even wrote legislation that predated the right to try, the Patient Choice Act, HR 2022. Basically because of my frustration out of the manner in which these massively powerful government agencies operate. And in the medical device world, which you're coming from, and I come from medical devices, the number of CEOs, whether they're drug company CEOs or device company CEOs, who literally have no voice to even talk about to be whistleblowers, because there's no whistleblower protection to the CEO of a company that's trying to get a drug to market. And it's just there's a lot of unfortunate action that occurs through the government agencies. So I am not of your view of the wishful hope that the government is going to operate in our best interest, because my experience is that they do not, and they certainly do not in cancer therapeutics. And not to say that we certainly need government oversight and regulation to a point, but there's such unbelievable overreach in what occurs, and there are fiefdoms, and there's egos, and there's
Humanity.
competing objectives. Okay, so but I want to get back to one thing you said, and that was sort of the complexity of the issue. So one of the things that I tried to come up with, for example, in hydroxychloroquine, is an example, is a simple example, and in marketing. So I'll take one step back. When I was running the cochlear implant division, and we were having to communicate highly complex technology to a mom of a 12-month-old child born deaf, one of the things I was in charge of doing was trying to figure out how to communicate these highly complex technologies to an average person. And so I've spent a long time, I think you share this marketing communication component. And so in regards to hydroxychloroquine, one example I use for it is, so imagine you're in a head-on collision, and then you put the seatbelt on after the accident, and then you use the data from your injuries and outcomes to assess whether the seatbelt worked. That's the studies that they're doing right now. That's understandable.
I got that. I like baby analogies. They work for me. They do.
So
I'm going to open the phone because some of these questions are pointed and intricate, and let me start with your cousin.
Oh, Jeremy.
Yay. So let me find him here. Jeremy, I'm making your microphone live. Thank you for today. Jeremy.
Oh, hi, everyone. Hey, Carla.
Tell everyone who you are.
Hi,
These are
Jeremy.
your cousin.
By the way, wonderful insights and perspective. And I think the answer has already been partially addressed, which was, there are so many good doctors out there. There is, to your point in terms of why haven't those studies been done in terms of the early intervention? With e-publications, you certainly don't have to wait 6 months. And with all the patients out there, you could certainly rapidly recruit the patients for this. So where are the studies, and why aren't they at least out there on an e-publication form in the United States I'm referring to?
So the studies are all now being required to be approved by the FDA. So you look at the studies that are available, and again, I haven't looked at the updated ones. A lot of them are following the very classic establishment approach. They're all being done at major university settings that are all following the guidance of essentially using the drug as a last ditch effort to save someone, which is exactly when the drug's not appropriate to use. So or certainly it might be usable, but it certainly doesn't affect the complications that have already occurred. So I don't know. I mean, for example, I'm actually working on a protocol. There are a couple physicians I'm looking at, possibly doing one. There's a physician in Las Vegas that is, actually suing the governor because he cannot get access outside of the state-run, state-operated hospitals. So, or government, hospitals. And so he's trying to be able to utilize it. And I've asked him if he would be interested in doing a trial there. And I've got physicians here in Los Angeles that are interested in doing a trial. But again, why should I be the one doing this? I mean, why should I be the one having to write a clinical trial? This should be, this is exactly what the government should be doing, but they're not. They're intentionally not doing it, and it's really frustrating.
You said, Jeremy, shall I move on to the next?
Yeah, thank you, Carla.
Yeah, one more thing, Jeremy, is that also there are, the trials that are looking at, non-hospitalized patients, which, in some of the cases I reviewed, they're only doing hydroxychloroquine. They're not using it with zinc, which they really should, and theoretically with a azithromycin as well. There are the ones that are only doing hydroxychloroquine, but are at least doing them in outpatient settings. The data is just not going to come in fast enough. So, I don't understand why, they can't, you can get there's so many patients coming in the United States at this point, the idea, that are test positive. The idea that we couldn't apply, get results in a couple of weeks is mind-boggling to me.
I have a 2.5-year-old in the background. I'm just hoping that with the president now, taking it, that'll increase awareness and perhaps early intervention treatment, because he's certainly doing it. So
he's taking it prophylactically. I don't necessarily think, I'm not someone who would necessarily take it prophylactically in this case. You can take it prophylactically for malaria to go on vacation, as I've mentioned a couple times. But in any case, I do think, especially given, the number of people and the shortages involved, I would think that, taking it as soon as you're test positive or symptomatic is when a physician ought to consider. They ought to consider it for people who are, higher risk. So for example, maybe someone who's younger and doesn't have any risk profile might not get prescribed it, but someone who's, 50 and above, and certainly someone who has known comorbidities ought to take it. But as far as the president taking it, it's no secret that physicians are taking it. So a lot of physicians have talked about it on television about how they're taking the drug. So I don't think there's any lack of awareness of people knowing that there are physicians treating patients taking the drug for this purpose. Same as the president.
Thank you, Jeremy.
And I'm sure there are a lot of people in the press corps taking it too.
I'm going to give the mic next to my friend Larry Stevens. But before I do, I think the thing that triggered me yesterday was the video of Neil Cavuto on Fox News imploring his listeners, and he said it 2 or 3 times. He said, "This will kill you." And I was thinking,
what will kill you?
Taking hydroxychloroquine
will kill you?
Isn't it so stupid? I need to write it out here so I can pronounce it properly.
Yeah.
And so I thought someone from the president's camp to be saying something so deliberately and fiercely against it was
Navarro. You want to be concerned with what Navarro has to say?
It was Jeremy. It was Neil Cavuto.
Neil Cavuto was saying it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Neil Cavuto is a journalist, a media.
I know, but
you're gonna take your advice from Neil Cavuto?
No, but all right, you got me. Larry, I've opened your microphone. You had some questions.
Well, yeah, this has been very revealing for me because I watch the TV just like everybody else, and I thought suddenly hydroxychloroquine had become dangerous, heart problems and all that. And listening to you, you know, I was very well aware that it's like was the first drug used in 1955, and it's millions and millions of doses. If this was a dangerous drug, it would be known. Okay.
Yes.
So what it's got politicized, and that's just terribly unfortunate.
Yeah.
Because the science is science. But I was wondering if I asked you, if I came to you and said, Carla, I want to do a study to show that this will prevent the spread, so to speak. In other words, that it's
the advance of the disease.
Prophylactically, or even then, take, you know, like go to seniors, go to rest home and give it to all the patients and see if they ever get any COVID-19 disease there. And I don't know. I just don't know what the study would. I know it would be a blinded study, and it would be statistically significant. The endpoints with all that, but I don't know what that would be.
Well, I mean, so there are quite a few studies that are doing it prophylactically, and as I said, some of their data is coming out. I mean, I did a whole chart, actually. I probably should get that for you. I'll give it to you. You can post it later, maybe. On 17 studies that when they plan on completing and when they plan on producing results. So most of them are coming in September, October, or 2021, and some are coming in 2022. I'm like, you guys, it's a little too late to give us data then. But doing a prophylactic requires a much bigger N, study. So, really the idea of this drug, and the thing that's so tragic about the politicization of this is that, right now there's a substantial amount of evidence, circumstantial evidence, that this drug works if used properly at the right time. But we don't have the large double-blind studies to lock it in. And so the idea that, that's the data that we need. We need it now, not in 2021. We need it, in 2 weeks. We need it yesterday. So, the idea that, we could, to really get the therapeutic effectiveness, the best study we could do would be as a therapeutic, to do it in patients who are, let's say, more susceptible to serious to develop serious COVID. So you've got a higher probability of patients that would go to the hospital, and then those that would go to the ICU. That helps you contain your sample size, right? So if you go with patients, let's say, or between 50 and 70, and then you do a double-blind study and evaluate them as soon as they're positive or as soon as they've been exposed. So now you've got, let's say, the chance of 20 to 30% getting hospitalized, and maybe 20 to 30% of those folks going into the ICU. And also depends on what their comorbidities are. That percentage could be higher. Now you can handle a reasonable N size, because you've got a reasonable percentage of patients that would normally go, and therefore by treating them, you can see the effect of how many will go to the hospital. The endpoint that I'm particularly looking for is how many patients go to the hospital. If you take the drug when you're symptomatic, and 30% are going to end up going to the hospital in this cohort as a normal, from what we've learned of this disease, and none of them go, you've got a pretty darn good proof point that it's working. And there are studies that are showing that. They're just, there's flaws in them, because everyone's running a million miles an hour. And so, they get picked apart. But the reality is that the studies that are coming out, like the VA retrospective, that is the biggest garbage study. It's not even a therapeutic study. I mean, they're data mining, and they're not even publishing the data mining results. At least the one that I covered from the New England Journal of Medicine, at least it was published. So at least I could go through it and show you exactly why the study is a completely flawed waste of time.
I've gone ahead and shared that in the comments section. Regrettably, I thought I had uploaded it properly, but I did not. So it's available for you folks now in the comments section. I'm going to give the microphone to Fred Boast next. He has a couple of comments. Fred, your mic is live.
Yeah, there's evidence that Tamiflu is effective even after full-blown. Yeah, of course, it's more effective prior to. And the scientists that do these research, they of course are scientists primarily, and so why do they risk their reputation? Because they obviously know the limits of their studies. The the duration of the onset, things like that. Thank you.
Thanks, Fred.
So there are definitely studies in antivirals and drugs that are used for patients like after they have become severely affected. So if someone ends up with, maybe has an influenza and ends up with a severe pneumonia and they end up in the hospital, and now they look to see what they can do to try to affect that. The idea of stopping continued replication and cell invasion by the time someone's in the hospital is not necessarily a bad thing. The problem is it's going to cloud the data results, because at that point the patient and it's going to have limited effect. I mean, if you take, for example, Valtrex for a herpes outbreak, that type of drug you have to take right away. I mean, it has virtually no effect if it's taken after someone's sun blister is full blown. It doesn't make it go away faster at that point, and doesn't make it become less severe. It has to, so certain drugs are more have more of an affinity than others to be effective that way. But even, it's not that you wouldn't necessarily use it late. It's just that you're not going, a lot of the outcome effects. So when someone dies of a heart attack or kidney failure or respiratory failure, or they're dying from blood clotting issues, they're from pulmonary embolism, from strokes, all caused by COVID, all caused by the advance of the disease. The disease is now systemically and highly invasive to the body at this point. So the effect and the complications of the disease, which are highly variable from a group to a group. You look at this group and there's 10 strokes, in that group there's 1, and that's people not treated with any of this stuff. And so the co-founding problems with that, first of all, from a perspective of using that data to produce efficacy results or safety results, are completely clouded by the vast confounding issues. So, in this particular case, some drugs are more effective early. This is one of those drugs, because of what it does, will be more effective early, and certainly testing it for therapeutical efficacy wouldn't be needed to be done early.
Thank you. I'm going to give the mic next to Victoria, my friend, but I wanted to ask you, first, I wanted to brag that I can say hydroxychloroquine. And that's
Wonderful.
It was because your cousin gave me a little mnemonic way to remember it. It's the X and the Y that screws me up, but okay. Enough about that. My self-appointed, perhaps inappropriately, but here I am, flawed, role is I'm trying to share the best information so people can make an informed decision. And now I don't know I mean, there's got to be someone to trust, somebody, is there a place for objective anything in medicine that I can just say, look, this is the answer? I'm trying to protect people. My wife would say, Joey, nobody appointed you for that job, and you don't know what you're doing, and she's always right about everything, but that's a different subject as well.
So, one of the conclusion of my paper, because I guess I'm a little bit jaded at this point with the state of affairs, and it's not only in this place of COVID. I've seen this in so many arenas with even some similar issues apply. For example, in the study of cancer therapeutics, and how and what data is being everyone's being led to believe it means, and it really doesn't mean that, and it's being misused. And there's a lot of reasons for that aren't being revealed, and in this case, God, the reasons and the biases that are involved are so disconcerting. And the basic thing that I came to the conclusion is to basically say to the physicians who are independent frontline physicians treating their patients, who have patients that come to them and say, hey, I've got COVID, or they test them and find out they've got COVID, or they've got symptomologies, is that, we don't have the luxury of time right now. Physicians prescribe off-label drugs all the time. If they see fit, if they don't know a lot about the drug, find a rheumatologist that prescribes the drug, has years and years of experience prescribing this drug. First, talk to them about the safety profiles and things like that. So you have experts that actually know this drug, and it's not Neil Cavuto on television, okay? Talk to them, you know, because certainly even the risks that are being suggested, there's no data and scientific data that says that those risks are true. In 70 years, those risks have never been illuminated. There's a couple of single patient case studies of someone been using the drug for 10 years at much higher toxic levels may have a complication. But there's no scientific studies on any of those things. So my advice is to find out from physicians, what is your plan? How do you treat COVID? Are you going to let me get to the hospital like my friend who's going to have his digits amputated, and he had a 1% chance of living. The fact that he lived is a miracle. But you're going to let me get that far before you intervene or not? Think about what it is you want to be done. Talk to your physician, see what his plan is. And for the physicians, who normally prescribe drugs, 1 in 5 off-label, and oftentimes with a lot less evidence than this, they're used, and with a lot more side effects and risks, they're used off-label. So theoretically, if you feel comfortable and you are not being banned by like the governor of New York or the governor of Las Vegas from using it outside of a state facility clinical trial, as long as you're not banned from using it and you feel comfortable using it and you've gotten yourself comfortable on how to prescribe it from an expert colleague, then do 20 patients that are over 50, and or if they have some relevant comorbidity like hypertension or whatnot, and do 20 patients. And if if we expect 30 of those patients to be hospitalized, hopefully you'll find that they're not. And if that works, continue doing it until you feel otherwise. That's what physicians do.
I don't know if you're available for therapy after this. I'm going to give Victoria the microphone. Hold on. Oops. Attendee is self-muted.
Okay, am I on?
There we go, Victoria.
Okay. Hi, Carla.
Hi.
So, hi. Thank you for speaking today. This has been exceptionally interesting and insightful. And just listening to your comments about going to the doctor before people enter the ER is exceptionally interesting, again, and insightful for each individual case. But the question that I had, I said, do you feel we should have taken the test kits from the World Health Organization in January, as they were termed basically the gold standard? Would this have been a global starting point that would have reduced the number of people affected?
Well, unfortunately, our system is not set up to allow for that. So our regulatory system is really, really constrained. And so the CDC so the CDC had to get FDA approval. The CDC got FDA approval from on February 4th. You cannot just take in the World Health Organization. First of all, the World Health Organization doesn't have test kits. It was, I believe, they were discussing something from whether it was China or some other country that they were discussing, but the World Health Organization doesn't make test kits. But the CDC controls how those are made, and they control, and then the FDA has to approve it. So whatever was taken, and it has to normally go through some kind of testing. So if you're going to bring an outside diagnostic into the United States, you can't just do that. The CDC has the ability to make something for research purposes and for limited for government use, but not to roll out for consumer use. So even the CDC had to get FDA approval. They were issued FDA approval of their test on February 4th, and they had been rapidly doing it from the time that the sequence was announced, I believe on January 9th or January 12th, the sequence was released, and they immediately started making the test codes. So the problem is that we couldn't have just taken it in. In fact, it probably would have taken longer, because as an outside diagnostic that wasn't generated by the government, we would have had to go through all this red tape. And then the next problem is that once the way the FDA for this type of PCR test, they the way the CDC, the use of CDC is for research purposes. All laboratories are all institutions that were going to use PCR testing had to have a research scientist. This is by regulation, is the only ones that can use it. They have to get approved through regulation. So they have to apply and get approved to the CDC. Then the rollout of all the equipment parts and all of the reagents is all managed through the IRR, which is controlled by the CDC. So they control the demand, all of which was set forth by the CDC. How much was going to be available. So they do all the stocking of the components for the testing, and they do all the distribution. So you have to go through the IRR, which is controlled by the CDC. So unfortunately, even if the tests that had been made outside of the country were the best tests possible, which they weren't, by the way, it would have been much more difficult to get an FDA approval on them, given our regulation. So one of the things that I believe the administration was trying to do was cut through a lot of the red tape to try to go around the regulations we have, because unfortunately, legislature makes laws. These bodies make regulations that become law, and they're not voted on. And that's part of the problem we have with how regulations expand in such a way that are well beyond the intended, legislation that was initiated. And so we now have these control systems that were just absolutely barriers, and they were barriers in, for example, Ebola. They had the same problems then when they were trying to roll out testing, and they didn't have something that was so rapidly contagious that the curve of need was like this. They didn't have that kind of curve of need, and yet they had significant response problems. So really, unfortunately, we need to look at our regulatory system in order to enable exactly what you said. And I don't have all the details about, why that test was perhaps substandard. But certainly getting it through our regulatory process would have been very difficult.
Yeah, you just answered my second question about, if the regulations would have been available before bringing something in as kind of, getting ready for a pandemic, something in perceiving something that would come up. And you just answered that second.
Yeah, unfortunately, our regulations they get worse, not better. So, the regulations continue to expand, and they continue to issue guidance from CDC and FDA and other agencies, and they just issue more and more guidance, which is why, our drug development process is, 15 plus years and $2 billion to get a drug to market.
Yeah.
And most of that is a waste of money and time.
Exactly. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Heather asks, you mentioned a documentary. What is the name of it, and what did it cover?
The name of the documentary is Fight to Live. It's available on iTunes, and it covers the access to investigational drugs with patients with terminal disease. And it was a film directed by Barbara Koppel, and it's quite a good film. And I am certainly the one that put that film together, and I do hope you watch it. It's a good film.
Noted. I'll see if I can't find the link and share it with folks. My friend Khalid is next. Khalid?
Oh, I didn't know you were going to put me on, but yeah, I was sorry.
You have been selected.
Awesome. Hey, it's really it's disconcerting to hear a lot of this, because there are pieces of data that seem to be coming out that when you don't connect them, they're innocuous.
Yeah.
And yet you put them all together and you get really worried about who's trying to protect what. And
Yeah.
I pride myself on being a scientist first and everything else second. I don't know where to go with this. I don't want to believe you. I'll put it that way. But I'm looking at the studies and thinking the same things.
Yeah. Well, I guess the paper that I had sent originally to Joe here, it did get out, but I do recommend you read it. I just, you know, it's not really, it's really just a white paper, not really intended for, you know, I didn't write it for publication. I really wrote it out of frustration to address the New England Journal of Medicine paper that had just been published on May 7th. And I'm looking at this going, you know, how is this even being published in the New England Journal? You know, this is when you look at the absolute massive flaws in the study, and this is then being headlined, you know, and the VA study, which is just, you know, ridiculous. And, you know, where are the studies that we need? And it's really frustrating. I agree totally. It's a frustrating.
Again, I mean, now we're, during the course of this call, I've been disavowed of necessarily believing the CDC, the WHO, the New England Journal of Medicine, and Neil Cavuto. And what, I mean, how, I'm going to go back to the question of like, is there anyone that we can elevate or talk to and say, here's some sense that we can trust, that can convince perception is reality, that now here's someone we can believe. I mean, people elevated Anthony Fauci, and that's felt good and right to me. You probably have an opinion there, which is an opinion.
Yeah, well, I mean,
go ahead and
I'll give you an
it.
example of my concern about Anthony Fauci, okay? So, you know, after making a concerted effort to, you know, to disavow hydroxychloroquine with, you know, with various comments and criticisms that he's made about it's not, the data's not scientific and it's, you know, anecdotal and blah, blah, blah. You know, he then turns around and presses for remdesivir. And, you know, there's a lot of backstory about remdesivir and Anthony Fauci. And the, you know, the concern here is he took a study. First of all, Gilead was doing some clinical trials for remdesivir, and NIH funded, you know, through grant, and so as a sponsor and funding, did an independent study on remdesivir that Anthony Fauci put together and funded, and then used that data to get Gilead an approval, which, I mean, the NIH doesn't do studies to get commercial drug companies approvals, okay? And yet here they did. And not only that, they changed the endpoint of the study midway. I mean, that's, you don't do that. And the FDA, normally, if you get even in an emergency situation, the FDA will work with the drug company to establish the parameters of the study and so forth. The study comes out. Everything that is problematic with this is problematic with that study. And the idea that there's any legitimate, given the confounding factors that aren't even considered in the study, that there's any true statistical significance in the study that's being used to promote remdesivir is outrageous. And yet here Anthony Fauci, with one study that he sponsored, he designed, he sponsored, and he funded on behalf of a commercial drug company, is now talking about how this drug is great, but hydroxychloroquine not good. And yet there's way more evidence on hydroxychloroquine and the study that he bases this on. So I was rather flabbergasted, to be honest with you, when I looked at him on television. I said, what on earth is he talking about? How could he, after everything his positions has been on hydroxychloroquine, how could he come out about remdesivir? And then you go back and you look at some, you know, other issues around Gilead and the drug and Anthony Fauci, and it becomes even more concerning. And so, you know, I've dug into that. That's another topic for another day. There's a lot of concerning issues regarding remdesivir. A lot.
We hit an hour, and I'm going to conclude with something that my friend Jeremy Carlisle just wrote in. He said, I don't have much to add except to reinforce your lament that there are no experts to lean on.
Yeah.
And
yes,
that just alarms me to a degree, because I mean, most things, there's a lot of noise, and this one says this and this, and I believe, from what I've consumed as a consumer of media, that coronavirus is really, really bad and not to be trifled with. And that the public needs correct information
Yep.
to deal with it effectively. And I'm sadly leaving this phone call with, I have no idea what the correct information is. And by the way, if it does exist, how would we possibly convince the world that that's the correct answer? And I'm hearing the fact that I'm coming to a null set of an answer just feels like it can't be the answer.
I agree. I understand. I mean, eventually the answers hopefully come out, over time. My concern I shared with you.
I'm just so inadequate here.
They don't know. I understand that. And so I'm with you. My frustration, which I think is probably palpable, is because I am very frustrated that I feel exactly, I have felt as you feel right now, I have been feeling that this is just not right. And that we aren't getting what we need. And this is not about, ivory tower establishment figures, who have biases and agendas and NIH grants, trying to drive an outcome of the assessment of a drug, which we really need to know the truth. We need to know if it works or not. I believe that it's worth trying under the circumstances. That's my position. I don't recommend anybody go do anything that they're not going to do with their own positions. But, I believe that I would rather roll my dice with that than a 30% chance of being in the hospital with hypoxia on kidney failure. So to me, I have to evaluate my own risk benefit, and I need to make sure I have a doctor who agrees with me. And aside from that, I don't have any more proof than anybody else. And so I'm in the same boat as you. And my frustration is that we should have this proof and it has been avoided for the wrong reasons. And so I leave this call also frustrated. And I'm only trying to maybe bring some enlightenment to maybe drive some change in what we need, because we need these answers and we need them now.
I think you can tell from my tone and my body language that I confessed earlier about being nervous, and I am now, but for an entirely different reason. So thank you for that.
Great.
On a brighter note, ladies and gentlemen, next week's caller is a dear friend of mine. Deborah Wall is, I believe now, the global marketing officer for Cadillac. She reports right into Mary Barra, and she's going to tell us about what GM's doing about ventilators, where they are, and I'm really looking forward to that. And I suspect I won't be as nervous. So you were delightful. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your education with us today. And reading the comments here, hi, kudos, thank you, this was informative, etc. So
wonderful.
thank
you so much.
All right.
Talk soon.
Bye, everyone.